Thank you for coming back together. We are using a new audio system. Now hope this works without some feedback. For those of you who don't know her, Alyssa Peltzman, who's organized this, is superb at making adjustments on the fly. So if this doesn't work, by the next session we'll have yet another audio system, and we'll keep doing it until we get it right. The topic for the session right now is common standards. This is perhaps the hottest topic in education right now, or at least one of them. And we're going to have a discussion here among people who are deeply involved in that effort, both at the national level and at the state level. And I suspect it will be a discussion that all of you are keenly interested in, and we'll make sure that there is time for your questions as the session goes on. This is a longer session than the previous one. We will be sure to leave time for your questions. Let me first just briefly introduce people on the panel, and I mean briefly, and then I'm going to say a few comments to set the stage for the discussion, and then we're going to go from there. So joining me on the panel from left to right, Janet Durfee-Hidalgo, who is the Education Policy Advisor to Governor Carcieri in Rhode Island. Who's over here? Eric Smith, the Commissioner of Education in Florida. Mitchell Chester, the Commissioner of Education in Massachusetts. Stan Jones, who is, I forget the name of your new organization, Stan.
It's Achieve More.
Stan Jones is the founding president of the National Consortium for College Completion. This is a brand new organization that's been founded. Stan reminded me that it's really just called Achieve More. It is. He is attempting to do for post-secondary education what Achieve has done for the rest of you. So good luck with that. Stan was the SHIO, the State Higher Education Officer in Indiana for a decade or so, and he brings that perspective today as well. Scott Montgomery from the Council of Chief State School Officers. I know the agenda indicates that Jean Wilhoit was to be here. Jean probably has the worst schedule of anyone in Washington, D.C., and he is routinely asked to be in about 3 places at once, and he could only be in 2 today. So Scott, thank you for joining us. And Dane Linn, who is the Director of the Education Program at the National Governors Association. So just to sort of start this off, what we want to do today is focus on the Common Core state standards effort. Where is it? Where is it going? What's it going to take for it to succeed? And just to put this in context and a little bit of history, as I mentioned in the previous session briefly, you all are at least one source of the Common Core standards effort right here in this room. The states in the ADP network, when you started working individually to align your own high school standards with the demands of post-secondary education and career, and when you began to work in teams across states at the alignment institutes that we did, a couple things happened there. One is you all got the job done. Over half the states now have revised their end of high school standards in math and English. And in anchoring your standards in the real world demands that students face, it was an inevitable side benefit of that, if you will, that because your kids all live in the same real world that knows no geographic boundaries, the expectations you're setting are becoming more and more common. And you've basically demonstrated the possibility of state leadership for Common Core standards when the history of debate around what we used to call national standards presumed a federal role. And there's been no real interest at the state level and hardly any interest at the federal level in the federal government going down this road again. But the states have demonstrated that it's possible for states to lead the effort. So the ADP network states have played a critical role in getting this work started. The National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers have played an enormous role in picking up the ball and moving from common standards as a byproduct of state work to a more intentional focus on getting states to a common core. And there are, and I lose track every day, there seems to be another state that has signed on, but we're somewhere in the 47 or 48 states that have committed to be part of this common core process to create a set of standards in mathematics and literacy and English language arts that really can be adopted across the states and provide a common set of expectations for them. This is, I think, a hugely significant development for a number of reasons. For some, the pursuit of national standards is, for some in the policy wonk community, I'm occasionally there, this has been sort of an effort that's been tried a number of times, and it looks like it's closer to success than anything else has come. And the chance to create a consistent set of expectations for students, consistently high and rigorous set of expectations for students that reflects the real world demands that they face. This is a golden opportunity to do that. Common standards can and will provide a foundation for common assessments, which could lead both to better information to guide the system, and also the ability to compare results across states, and if done well and with some federal help, can help states save money that they would otherwise spend on their own testing systems. But I think there's something even more important than those things. We spent a little bit of time in the last session talking about the need for great teachers in every classroom. One of the things that's been missing, in my judgment, from the state standards movement since it started about 2 decades ago, states have done a good job of setting the standards, they've done a good job of putting tests in place, they've done a good job of holding schools accountable for results. Haven't done as good a job in most cases at providing the tools and supports that teachers and students need to actually meet the standards. That has been slower in coming. It's been more uneven across the states. In effect, when it came to those issues, every state for a while at least turned out to be a local control state. And the obligation to provide the tools that could make this succeed in the classroom fell on district after district after district, school after school after school, and teacher after teacher. To me, the most important thing about common standards, and the reason that I think if these standards look good to you, they ought to be adopted so that there really are common standards across the states, is that it provides the opportunity for significant collaborative efforts across states and across districts to create high-quality instructional materials, high-quality formative assessments, high-quality professional development, all aligned to standards that states can do better together than any of you can do on your own. So I think there is an enormous game-changing opportunity here if we can take advantage of it. Achieve is part of the partnership of organizations that is developing the standards. You'll hear more about that in a second, but I'm confident that we've got the right players in place, the right process in place to produce a very high quality set of K-12 standards aligned with the demands of college and work in a very short timetable. I'm confident that we can produce a very high quality set of standards that will be worthy of adoption. That's why we're in this game. And we hope that you'll see it that way and take the steps necessary across the states to adopt the standards when they come out. So we'll have a good conversation about these issues, but I wanted to just frame the discussion that way. And to start us off, I want to sort of put the first questions to Dane and to Scott Montgomery from NGA and CCSSO. They've figured out how to divide up the answers, but the basic question is, where are we in the process now? How are we going forward?
Thanks, Mike.
Dane?
And thanks for the opportunity to be here this morning. I don't think we'd be where we are on the Common Standards Initiative if it weren't for the work of Achieve and the America Diploma Project and the work that the states have done. So what we're attempting to really do through this project is to build on the work that has been done over the past couple of years through the network, the ADP network. Before I describe try to describe very clearly where we are in the process, I first want to say that it's important to remember what the three guiding principles are to the work that we're engaged in right now. So the standards that we're attempting to develop are really aimed at three criteria. One is that they're fewer, clearer, and higher. That they're really guided by the evidence is the second one. And I think when you see the release of the standards next week, you'll have an opportunity to online see what the evidence is for each of those standards that you'll be able to access. And the last one is that they're internationally benchmarked. And the work groups have really worked very hard to identify some best practices from not just around the world, but from some of our high-performing states, some of the states with some very high standards, and states that perform well on international assessments, states that have been externally reviewed by others and ranked very high on the quality of their standards, the rigor of their standards. So there are a whole host of evidence, a whole range of evidence that has been used to inform the draft of college and career readiness standards that you'll see next week. Where we are in the process is we have been focusing on, not assuming that everyone has been as immersed in this process as we have been. I may provide some information that's redundant for some of you, so bear with me. But we are only focusing on English language arts and mathematics at the outset. Those are the foundational skills. We'll get to other subjects later, but we first need to demonstrate success around those core subjects. The first task has been to develop a set of college and career readiness standards for all students in those two subjects. We fortunate or unfortunate, had what I call an unintentional release, otherwise known as the leak of the standards, which has really provided us an opportunity to hear from a lot of different organizations, individuals. We are grateful. See me at the bar at 10:30. But we have, in addition to the unsolicited feedback, we have met with a number of key organizations. We've met with members from the NEA, the AFT, the Council of Great City Schools, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, the National Council of Teachers of English, which have included, for those two subject area, NCTM and NCTE, representation from the higher ed community as well, faculty, college faculty. And they brought together their members in the month of August to DC to meet with us and give us feedback on those standards. In addition, we have worked very closely with 6 states, ADP states, and they have themselves put teams together of individuals in both subject areas who spent time giving us some very candid feedback. All of the solicited and unsolicited feedback that we've gathered, and we have feedback from over half the states thus far. And I would say comments from over 300 individuals and organizations around the country. That information has been reviewed by the work team and incorporated into the revised document that you're going to see next week. For those of you that don't know the name of the website, it's corestandards.org. You'll be able to access those standards, and again, you'll be able to link. There's a hyperlink for each standard to the evidence that was used to inform the decision that the work group made. Mind you that the work groups that we formed are really comprised of individuals from around the country with expertise in those subject areas, English language arts and mathematics. We'll talk a little bit later about how we're going to expand that as we move into K-12. But once those standards are released, there's going to be a 30-day window for comment. And we really encourage the states, even if you've already reviewed them, review them again. Compare them to the comments that you have. Compare them to the standards you have now. And really bring together the essential people in your state to provide comment on those standards. Once that window closes, the work group will reconvene to revise the standards. And the standards will then go to what we've called the National Validation Committee. All states had an opportunity to nominate individuals to serve on that validation committee, and we'll individuals that range from early childhood through post-secondary. They're individuals with expertise, again, in those two subject areas. And they're the individuals who will review not only the standards, but the evidence. And once we have their feedback, I can't imagine that we'll be able to finalize them at that point. We may need to make an additional revision, but we'll be able to then go to the development of the K-12 standards. And it's from that point that we will expand the work groups to include more practitioners on the work groups and additional individuals that will help us to develop the K-12 standards. And with a very deep breath, we're hoping to finish that process by the end of, have them approved by the end of January. There's going to be an opportunity early on, and Scott will talk a little bit about this later, an opportunity very early on in this process for states to give us feedback on those standards, the K-12 standards, that is. Anything to add?
Nope, I think you got it all on that.
Okay.
Thank you, Dane. I suspect there'll be a few questions on some of that process as we get into the discussion. Let me come back to either one of you for a second. One of the things that I know from our conversation states are keenly interested in is what are the expectations for adopting the standards, and to the extent that you can, and Joanne Weiss is here, she may be able to weigh in on this later as well, but what's the relationship between the expectations for adoption that states signed on to when they signed on to this process in the first place, and the federal government's expectations for adoption, which come with a few sort of large incentives? Just sort of talk about the adoption expectations, please. Scott?
Yeah. So can I just, before I do that, I also want to echo what you said early on in the beginning, and also what Dane picked up on, in that we appreciate the work that was started in this room, and will continue with the folks in this room as we get into the K-12 work. I think it's, we wouldn't be in the place where we are if it hadn't been for this network of states. And so I wanted to say thank you for that work that you all have done. As it relates to adoption, our MOA that the states have signed, now 48 of them, talks about a 3-year adoption cycle, or a 3-year adoption window. I think when we wrote the MOA and talked about adoption, we really did talk about adoption with the idea of full implementation, meaning adopting the standards, putting in place the assessment system, putting in place the curricular supports, all the professional development that went around the adoption, into full implementation, and actually having that take place within a 3-year window. We thought it was necessary to put some kind of time parameter on it so that you didn't adopt the standards and then, not show any action in a relatively, quick amount of time. Our MOA really talks about adoption in that form, full implementation. Those of you who've read Race to the Top application and are busy working frantically right now on those applications, know that adoption is mentioned in a couple different contexts, whether it's the first phase or the second phase. I think, and I don't speak for the department, but I think our interpretation is, and you can talk about our meeting the other day and see if this is right. In this first phase let's not talk about race. I think the department's definition of adoption is the official state action by the authorized entity within your state to take action to adopt those standards. For many of you, that's your state board. In some cases, it's also your state legislature, and in 1 or 2 places, I think your governor actually has to have sign off as well. If you think about pure adoption of the standards, I believe that's correct, that's the adoption process. If you think about them in terms of adoption and implementation, I think there's a longer window there. But for adoption, and especially as it relates to the big incentive of the $350 million around assessment, I believe that adoption really is the official action by your state authorized agency.
Thank you. Let me
Want to add to that?
again, I know, Dane, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think the real challenge here is that, as I understand, and maybe my interpretation is incorrect, but the draft regs that came out around Race to the Top, that states have to adopt the standards by June of 2010. And we had, as Scott indicated, this 3-year timeline laid out in the MOA that states who are participating, the 48 of you, signed off on the MOA. So I think that's an issue, an unresolved issue that we're going to have to continue to talk about with the department.
Thank you. By the way, I've just been handed a note that probably applies to me, but should apply to the rest of you. We have to have the microphones very close to our mouths in order to be picked up. So I'm going to, as we move the conversation, we're going to move the microphone around a bit as well. And I'm going to turn now to Mitchell Chester and ask, essentially from a state point of view, how do you size up the Common Core effort, and how do you think about adoption, whether and how to adopt? What's your sort of approach to that?
Thanks, Mike. First, I just want to acknowledge the role of CCSSO and NGA. This is a challenging project. I just can't imagine, the notion of common standards across states is something that we would have had a tough time putting on the table a decade ago, let alone the kind of momentum that's developing at this point and bubbling up from the states and the challenges of corralling this. I'll just highlight 2 tensions and then give a response on the adoption piece. That 2 tensions that I see that are absolutely core to the process that's playing out. The first tension is the process of developing the standards, and I think of it as a tension between the way in which states typically go about developing standards and the process that I believe CCSSO and NGA, with Achieve's help, have to navigate to get us successfully to a set of college-ready, career-ready, internationally benchmarked standards. Typically, when states go about developing standards, we seek a wide range of input, and we try to ensure that the standards that result represent a wide range of perspectives on what should be in those standards. I think we're at about a very different task here with these standards, in the sense that we want them to be evidence-driven, not driven by ideology or folks' desires for what should be in there, and evidence-driven in terms of whether or not they represent college and career ready, whether or not they are internationally benchmarked, and those touchstones that we keep hearing, fewer, clearer, and higher, really requires that the development process, at some level, while it's open to input, guards itself against trying to be all things to all people. And that tension's huge, and again, I think it's falling on the shoulders of NGA and CCSSO, and I want to acknowledge that. And I've been a fan of supporting the work of those 2 organizations in not trying to let these standards be all things to all people. Second tension, and this is a really interesting one. To the extent that we really are aiming higher, college ready, career ready, internationally benchmarked, we're aiming for something that's very different than we have in operation in our states right now. And so the question becomes, how far out in front of the system should these be? If they're too far out in front of the system, they'll become irrelevant. They'll become an academic exercise, but if the system can't begin to think about how to stretch itself to reach them, they're going to fall by the wayside. The draft of the English Language Arts Common Core Standards really drives this home. My take on that draft is that they're largely communication standards, reading, writing, speaking, listening, that cut across subject area domains. My take is that they're not specifically the province of English language arts teachers, and they don't represent a typical English language arts curriculum in that respect. So it really kind of challenges how we organize for schooling right now and who's responsible for teaching reading, writing, speaking, listening, and the challenges that all of us have faced in getting our content area teachers to see themselves as a part, having responsibility for delivering on those, and recognizing that those communication standards have subject-specific implications, and you can't leave them solely to the English language arts teachers. So kind of if we test for these, and if the evidence is taking us there that these are critical to college career-ready international benchmarking, if we test for those, who owns them? How do they get delivered in our schools? It's really going to stretch us. I don't think that's a reason for us to be shy about taking that on, but it's something we're going to have to grapple with as we move forward. And I think it's good for us to have to kind of face those kinds of questions and deal with those kinds of issues around our schools. In regard to our schools and how we organize for schooling and whether we're aimed at the right stuff for kids. Finally, to the question of adoption. And I think the distinction that's been made here in a couple of ways. There's sort of the formal official adoption. We embrace these standards, and there's the implementation of the standards. And in my mind, developing the standards, developing assessments that go with them is a hugely challenging task, but it pales in comparison to the task of how do we ensure that our students, classroom by classroom, school by school, are in fact experiencing a program of study, curriculum, and instruction that's consistent with those standards. You know, Massachusetts is often cited as a state that has very high quality standards and assessments, but there's no question in my mind that only some of the students in Massachusetts experience a program of study consistent with those expectations, and that too many of our students don't experience that program of study. Final comment to Chairman Barrett. I believe, to my knowledge, we are the first state that, as one policy step toward ensuring that all teachers in fact, have a good grounding in mathematics. We are beginning now requiring that as part of the licensing process to be an elementary or a special ed teacher, not just a math-specific teacher, that you have to demonstrate knowledge of mathematics through a separate assessment of your knowledge.
Thank you, Mitchell. You've got a number of things on the table here. I don't want to respond to them yet. I want to just keep giving other people an opportunity on the panel to weigh in. So I'm going to turn to Eric Smith next. Eric, you've been in the process of, you've recently adopted new English standards in Florida. You're in the middle of a process to adopt new math standards, where you're part of the fourth cohort of states to participate in our Alignment Institute, and you're sort of midway there as this process unfolds. How does this look to you? How do you think about adoption in Florida?
We absolutely love adopting standards. So we're doing this time and time again on the back of each other. It's a delightful exercise. But before I get into that, I'd like to start out just by, again, Chris and I sat a while back somewhere up here in D.C. at a breakfast meeting and scribbled on a little napkin. This would be kind of cool. It's I think a real statement about this nation and about how we've matured on this issue of standards and expectations of our kids, and the high quality organizations such as Achieve and CCSSO and National Government Association to be able to pull this together, and the leadership in those organizations to pull this together for our nation in a way that has proven to be, I think, even at this stage, I would call this work a success because of the level of deep analysis and reflection on where we are as a state, and I think other states certainly are doing the same exercise. So I think this has been certainly an engaging and productive process, and will result in huge progress going forward for the nation. I think back at our Chicago meeting, us commissioners were insistent that we don't want to drag our feet and look bureaucratic. We want to be aggressive on this thing and get this job done. This has gone way beyond our wildest expectations of December timeframe and June timeframe for adoption and so forth. In Florida, certainly we will work to meet those requirements using our normal processes of vetting standards with post-secondary and secondary alike, and validation with other states, and review with other institutions and organizations, and work to move that process along expeditiously, I think. So, and our legislature and governor certainly are aware of what this means for us, a state that is in the midst of transitioning with the math and reading language arts adoptions. This is regardless of what your state policy is, and I think that it's certainly our state board has the authority to adopt new standards following guidelines that have been approved through our legislature. But this is something that I think I'd be a fool for if I didn't think that legislative support for this would have to be broad and deep, because of the financial implications for the state of Florida long term. And so long and good conversations with our legislature in terms of the implications after just going through a textbook adoption in mathematics to adopt new standards in mathematics would be something we'd need to think long and hard about and discuss. This is the bottom line, though, coming out of Florida, is that our only big precondition on this whole venture is that this moves this nation forward, that we don't have a single state in the country that views this as a step backwards or a retreat from the kind of expectations for our kids that we must have, that it is a movement forward. The only thing that would cause us pause would be if we saw a diminishing of what was required and expected in our program, and in any way a weakening of that connection between K-12 and post-secondary or workforce. That's our precondition for this, and that we do have connection through these standards to international measures and an ability to compare our students' performance with students of other states, so that we can work more collaboratively and more in a problem-solving mode to move our state forward. That's our only precondition. With that condition being met, I'm confident that Florida will seek to, one, adopt the standards and determine the right timeline financially and logistically and from a human resource standpoint, a capacity standpoint, to move towards implementation on as rapid a time frame as possible. I think that it is critical, as Mitchell mentioned, I do love standards. I actually like to talk about them and spend days working on standards. Something I don't necessarily get up in the morning saying I can't wait to get to standards discussions, but I would say standards in and of themselves have very little value, and so I think in this exercise we must keep in mind with this expectation of moving the nation forward, of what this is really about, and it is not really about coming together around standards. What it's really about is improving the achievement of our children in all of our states and in our nation. What it is really about is improving the quality of instruction in our nation and in our states. What it's really about is bringing about a better analytical assessment of where we are and how we need to improve. It is really about improving the ability of states to collaborate and work together and jointly find solutions to problems. And finally, and very important, is that it is a way to manage cost and make things make these accomplishments reasonable in a financial standpoint. So as we structure these things up, it's one thing to say that we are moving forward, that we're going to be more rigorous, that we're going to, in fact, connect post-secondary with K-12 and be internationally benchmarked. But it's a different conversation if we're talking about this collaboration of states is about the fundamental restructuring of K-12. That's a different conversation, one that is a very difficult lift And I think we need to be cautious about how standards get framed, that they are, in fact, at the end of the day, things that can be implemented. And so, with that caution in mind, I think that we're for one, as a state, we are excited about it. It is a topic of state conversation in PTAs and at the local level and at the state level. It is a topic that people are well aware of, and one that we're prepared to engage in as time goes forward.
Thank you, Eric. Let me just flag one thing as we go forward. The issue of how far the set of standards that are being developed now, how far they can push the system, how far out ahead, is one that I think we're going to hear echoed throughout the discussion, and I think is the sweet spot there is not entirely clear, and it may be slightly different in every state. Having a set of standards that are really next generation and forward-looking and feasible and within reach of the education system is an important factor to take into account. Janet, Rhode Island's one of 3 states in New England that actually went through a process of developing common common assessments. So how from that point of view, from that perspective and that experience, how does this look to Rhode Island?
Yeah, I would like to echo both Mitch and Eric in terms of the place where we are now as a nation in the conversation, that we absolutely have moved forward, and I think that we have a much better definition of what the challenge is, always being very sensitive to and cognizant of what is the actual goal that we're trying to accomplish. And I would say very strongly that as one thinks about how this can occur state by state, if we do not stay focused on what that end goal is, and I would support how Eric framed that, then we will be less likely to achieve that goal. In terms of the New England context, it's kind of interesting. I was thinking about it from a couple of different perspectives. One, in terms of how encouraging the conversation already is today, because we aren't just thinking about the standards, we are very sensitive to just having standards and assessment are necessary but not sufficient conditions for getting the kinds of results that we need to have with our students. And as I think about that and the importance of that and our ability to get to that next arena effectively, the New England experience has been focused primarily on the standards and assessment process, and very successfully. So as I think about adoption, for example, Dane and Scott, one of the things that as comments occurred around the Common Core, these initial standards, we were careful to reach out to the other New England states to determine what kind of feedback was going to be provided, because we should have somewhat of a common voice around what that looks like and how it relates to what we currently have and administer through our assessments. In terms of actually moving to the areas of high quality instructional materials, formative assessments, professional development, the things that are actually going to move performance, which I think was echoed this morning earlier in the first session, we don't have that experience. And in fact, that is kind of the next phase conversation that needs to happen. As you think about what are the formative assessments that teachers can use to actually better deliver their instruction and drive performance, we haven't had a conversation, at least not that we're aware of in our office, around how could we do that collectively. And I'm not so sure that that's occurred really anywhere. So I guess I see that as a very significant challenge, as well as a wonderful opportunity that the Common Core bring. The only other thing I would mention as I think about this work and the issue of adoption that you raised, Mike, timelines are interesting things. And I have to say that one thing that we are going to have to be very sensitive to is the issue of relationships. As we think about relationships, state by state, they are really quite unique and different, and they're fluid. It depends on who's in place, at what point in time, and where they may have their own particular interest or bent. So as you think about governance structures and how those exist between governors and departments of education and higher ed systems, and relationships with General Assembly, you think about relationships between teacher unions and departments of education and governor's office. You think about parents and students and the adoption of these standards. If we do not take into consideration the relationships that exist in states, it will be, we will not experience success. And I think we have to be extremely thoughtful about what those look like and being very careful about ensuring that we engage all of those very important players. And I have to say, one of the voices that's emerged in Rhode Island, which is absolutely wonderful, is youth voices. There's been an organized process for pulling together young people in some of our urban communities to raise their voices up about what they want to have and need to have. And so I just, relationships I find are so critical to success.
Thank you, Janet. I just want to let the panel know. I'm going to pick up on some of those comments about relationships in a minute and try to explore with you who actually needs to be involved in the decision-making process in the state, and how does the process going forward compare with the typical way of getting people involved. But before I do that, I want to turn to Stan Jones. When Stan was the state higher ed officer in Indiana, Indiana was one of the first states in the American Diploma Project effort, and one of the first states to adopt college and career-ready standards. And the sort of question I want to put to you with your Indiana hat on, as well as your national perspective, is talk a bit about what role higher education needs to play in states as these college and career-ready standards move forward. How do we make sure that among the people and institutions that agree that these are college-ready standards are the colleges themselves? Could you answer that, Stan?
Sure, but first I want to answer my own question. Is that okay?
Yeah, and if you want to take over moderating afterwards, you just go right ahead.
Okay. Well, I mean, actually, I think really the first issue in terms of the collegiate level is really awareness, and I don't think that within the higher education community that there's really this awareness of where we are. I think right now you might say that we're having huge success in sending more young people to college. 75% of all high school graduates start college within 2 years of graduating from high school. But it's really starting ready to fail. Some of you have lived through the high school dropout debate. The college dropout rate is probably closer to 40% of students that start never finish. At community colleges, it can run as high as a 60% college dropout rate. And I think people aren't aware of that. One of the things that kind of got my attention on this is about 8 or 9 years ago in Indiana, when we were starting our community college initiative, and part of which was to get more high school students to go to college right away. Not long after we started, I got these calls from our community college campuses saying, "Stan, this isn't working." And I said, "Well, what do you mean that this isn't working?" They're saying, "Well, these high school kids, we're recruiting them, they're coming, they're not ready." We ran our database, and I asked our data person to run a list of the students that graduated in the spring from high school and walked across the street and started at the community college in the fall. 60% of those students started in remedial classes. And Indiana's not unique. Across this country, 60 to 70% of all the new starts from high school are starting out in remedial class, overwhelmingly in mathematics. And we usually think about these remedial classes as necessary for older adults coming back. In fact, they're better prepared than the ones right out of high school. Unless we leave our four-year colleges alone, many of the four-year colleges in your states that are not selective or semi-selective have 25 to 30% of their high school graduates starting in remedial classes. And they have college graduation rates of maybe 30, 35%. Actually, I think they should be called six-year universities because it's more likely that students will take 6 years to graduate than 4. So we have this huge numbers of students that start. We're winning that battle, but they clearly aren't ready, and overwhelmingly it's in mathematics. And so I think part of the answer to Mike's question really is awareness. I think both at the college level and within public policymakers who we have as a country believe very strongly that the answer to a lot of our problems are getting kids to college and giving them that opportunity. For so many of them, it's really a false promise that can't be realized. So I'd say number one is really awareness that this is really a substantial problem, and that it's really starting ready to fail. But secondly, the work of Achieve launched in 1996, now over a dozen years old, and really pioneers on the standards movement. I mean, they had to teach some of us, okay, what is a standard? And why would that be important to anybody? And we've come a long way. But I can recall at that meeting in 1996, the president of Alcoa standing up and saying, explain to me why algebra should be materially different in West Virginia than it is in Pennsylvania or in Illinois. How is that possible that that should be the case? You know, we don't stamp our aluminum products made in West Virginia only for use in West Virginia. It's so we have a kind of a balkanized system of standards in this country, and so now we're a dozen years later, most of this effort that Achieve has really pioneered has been the K-12 partners pushing uphill on this standards battle with very little participation from higher education, and I think it's unfortunate. And so I think as hard as it is, I used to say. I didn't choose to work with people because I wanted to work with people. I didn't have a choice. I have to work with people. In the higher education... And so sometimes these alliances are uncomfortable, but I think you have to cause the partners to be at the table and to have these conversations and to say to the higher education partners in your states, should we spend all this time, effort, and money doing this? Does it make a difference to you? How can we do this better? How can you be partners? And I think that I'm impressed at the higher education participation that you've got in this room. I think historically that's not been typical. And so I think that the two things I'd say is awareness is really important. And secondly is that higher education really needs to be at the table. Not just the higher education policy people, but you need your math and English people at the table as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Stan. Mitchell, I want to come back to you with sort of a pick up on one of the first points you made about the tension between the typical way of developing standards in which a state gathers everybody who has something to say about it and tries to build a consensus versus this more evidence-driven approach that we're trying now. So when the standards are done and there's a discussion in Massachusetts about whether to adopt them or not, I assume the usual suspects who care about standards and who you would typically have rounded up and said, let's get around the table and talk about what these standards ought to look like, are going to want to have the same kind of conversation and get their fingerprints on the standards just as they typically would have. And if that occurs, we'll lose anything that remotely resembles common by the time that happens in every state. So how do you think about the kind of engagement that's necessary with the K-12 educators, with the business community, with the higher ed community? How do you think about managing that kind of engagement that is necessary for the consensus to adopt in a manner that keeps the Common Core standards intact?
So our state board meets on Tuesdays. Maura Banta, my chair, is here. So I'm thinking we'll release them for comment Monday evening, about 10 o'clock in the evening.
Maura's apparently not thinking that.
But I haven't cleared that with Maura yet, so we haven't had that discussion. I think there's a couple of levels to that, and I'm not sure I've thought through this as well as I need to. But in Massachusetts, the State Board of Education has the authority and responsibility for adopting standards. So they're clearly the primary audience, have to feel confident that whatever emerges from this process is worthy of adoption, doesn't take us backward in any way, makes a lot of sense. And we have a couple of board members who feel very passionately about these two particular subjects, and they will scrutinize these standards. So I think it's going to be critical that the process that evolves the standards has a good evidential base to it to support what's emerged from those standards. I think if that's present, and all the touchstones that have been discussed here are present, I think that we're in a good position to make the case that these are worthy of adoption. In terms of a public involvement, there's clearly a number of stakeholders. I mean, there's sort of inner ring, certainly the governor's office, the legislature need to feel a sense of confidence about what's being proposed here. I think Stan's comments about higher ed are huge, not just for the initial adoption, probably less so for the initial adoption, but for actually implementing these. I mean, I just feel very strongly that at least in the states in which I've worked, that higher ed does not send clear signals to the K-12 sector about what college ready means, what's acceptable preparation, what's not. And clarity around those signals, I think, will provide tremendous leverage for getting the K-12 sector to pay attention to the programs of study that students are experiencing. So I think it's critical to have higher ed on board. And we have Andrea Kelly here from our Department of Higher Ed and Pat Plummer from the UMass system. And no different than a lot of states represented in the room, that's a complicated process because it's not a unitary system per se. So I would highlight those two areas.
Thank you, Mitchell. Janet, do you want to make a comment on that? And then, Eric, I'm going to ask you a different question to get another issue on the table.
I might want to answer my own question first.
Yeah.
Mike, just thinking about the adoption process and knowing that state by state we have this state's current standards are in very different places as it relates to the Common Core, so that you have some states that may be very close to what is emerging, and you have some maybe that are more rigorous. And then you have some that are far from what those standards are going to reflect. So this is actually more of a question than an answer. As one thinks about adoption, and maybe Dane and Scott, what are the, I don't want to say necessarily differentiated communication strategies, but it seems like there are some specific nuances that should be taken into consideration in terms of how one communicates about these. And go.
I don't want to interrupt you while you're. No, actually, so we've thought a lot about the adoption process. One of the things that Dane and I were kind of whispering together is we know, we've started to run those screens, and you know, as different as all of your states are, your adoption processes are that different as well. I mean, some of you have a 60-day public comment before they go to the board, and then others have a legislative approval before they go to board action, and then 60 days before. I mean, you're all over the place, but you all have a process that you work through. You know, as we talked about what adoption means both for, you know, as you think about both Race to the Top and your own adoption process, I think one of the things that we've thought about is we need to have those communication processes in place. We need to actually work with states both collectively and individually. And one of the things we're planning on doing now, and we don't have a date yet, and I'm not making an invitation at this particular point, but is actually bringing together the governors, the chiefs, and the state board chairs to have this exact conversation. Because on that kind of expedited process, you can't do it if you're going to look for adoption in a really quick time frame on your normal basis, because there's a whole lot of things that are going to be in flux and moving. So I think that we're committed to actually thinking about how we assist you in doing that, and making the adoption process as easy and painless and as expedited a process as possible, so we can possibly do that.
Thank you, Scott. Mitchell asked to amend his answer, and then I'm going to let Eric answer whatever question is on his mind. And then we'll go to your questions.
So I don't think it would be 10 o'clock Monday night. Only. So, you know, I talked about kind of the evidentiary base. It seems to me there's another critical touchstone for the state board, which is how do the standards that emerge compare to the standards that we have? And that's going to be a critical analysis. To what degree are they? Do they represent at least the same level of expectation? Where do they dovetail? Where do they depart? That understanding, I think, is going to be critical to make the case to the State Board of Education. I just want to say one word about what I see as the tremendous value of Achieve and the work that's done through the American Diploma Project. And I've highlighted how critical CCSSO and NGA are to making this whole project happen. But to the analysis, I mean, Achieve's got the ability to provide each of your states with that crosswalk between your current standards and the emerging national Common Core standards, which is just usually useful. And one of the conversations I've pushed with NGA and CCSS over the last couple of months is we need to find a way. We need to make sure that the ADP work stays central to the Common Core work, because so many of our states have invested strongly in the ADP work as part of our standards process. So I'm really pleased that NGA and CCSSO have recognized that and are honoring that as we go forward.
Thank you, Mitchell. Eric, what question is on your mind?
Well, no, again, any question you might have, but I would just reinforce this discussion around post-secondary. And we're very fortunate to have post-secondary and workforce career readiness leadership from our state with us on this team, and I know most of you have that. But as we've in Florida, we have under the Department of Education the state college system and everything except the four-year institutions, and we've found that to be very helpful in our work around the standards. There's one thing to have as an objective to increase college readiness, which is clearly understood, I think, with this exercise. It'd be nice if the universities and state colleges in our country were ready to receive an increased population of college-ready youngsters with a goal in mind to move forward with baccalaureate production and so forth. And I think that shouldn't be just assumed that that's the case, that there are multiple goals and objectives that post-secondary has that are very legitimate and very meaningful. And without making that connection, that relationship between post-secondary and those programs that feed into post-secondary, you could find the standards match up, but still the objectives don't match up for what you're trying to accomplish in your state from a human capacity standpoint.
Thank you, Eric. Well, I think we've got quite a few issues out on the table for discussion, and I'd very much like to turn the discussion over to the rest of you in the room. So you've got an opportunity to either offer some observations or ask some questions to any of the panelists here. So I'm assuming there might be one or two questions, comments. Alice?
Thank you. I really appreciate Scott and Dane's suggestion of bringing the chiefs, the state board leaders, and others together to talk about the adoption. I would suggest for some states that you may want to consider bringing also the legislative leadership together, whether it's probably a combination of speakers of the House and Senate leadership and chairs of the education committees. We have a rulemaking process, and Karen and I were just sitting here thinking that our math process, the legislature just reviews, and then we do rulemaking, but our rulemaking process is about 8 months to a year. If it's non-controversial, it's about 8 months. We would need to start now, guys, and we don't even know what the Common Core is going to look like yet. So our option would be then for the legislature to adopt the standards and eliminate the rulemaking, or officially adopt and then go ahead and put them in rule with, an official adoption. But it really does mean that some states have, this legislative process, and I think it would really be helpful to bring them to the table to understand, the consensus around this work and the importance of getting it done. But they need the assurances that you've had a lot of vetting nationally with experts that would give them some comfort, I think, as we would move forward.
Yeah. Thanks, Alice. States are going to have the opportunity to bring key leadership. Who are the critical stakeholders? And legislators are certainly one of those. And in addition, we're doing some work with NCSL. Next week, we're going to have a call with several hundred legislators around the country. We have a lot of work to do with the legislative community and helping them understand what this effort is, what it's all about, and the role that they're going to play. And we're really targeting Senate Education Committee and House Education Committee leadership.
Thank you, Dane. Questions, comments? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to echo the call for support for states to do that crosswalk, the alignment between what we currently have and what's being proposed. But also I just wanted to ask a question, if you could speak a little bit more about the evidence base for the career readiness aspect of the standards, how we're from Washington State, and how will we help our biggest employers like Microsoft and McKinsey understand that these standards are really in line with their expectations for their incoming workers?
Thank you. Let me answer both those questions, and if you want to speak to the evidence also, that'd be great. First of all, we have been talking, the chief staff have been talking about how we can provide each state with a side-by-side comparison of the Common Core and your own state standards, and do that as quickly as you need it in order to be able to have the conversation. We don't fully have that answered yet, but we think there's a process that will either involve convening you or some kind of web-based approach in which your state people actually play a role in the analysis. So it's not just sitting and waiting for us to do it. It's got to be a bit more of an interactive process. And we think there are a couple of things that would be important about that comparison. I want to stress this. It's one thing to ask, how well do the Common Core and your state standards align, as though the job is not only to make a judgment about the Common Core, but then to begin to modify your own standards. And I worry about going down that road because I think it's going to make it harder to achieve the objective of a Common Core. So there's another analysis, another way of looking at this that I think would be important, which is when you compare your standards to the Common Core. When we help you do that, one key question to ask is, if we adopt the Common Core, where will we see them and experience the most disruptions? What are the situations in which the math we taught at 3rd grade is now at 4th grade, for example, or 2nd grade or whatever? And if we're going to go in that direction, what are the implications of that for instructional materials, for professional development, for assessment, et cetera? I think Those are really important questions that we think we can help you identify and answer when you compare current and Common Core standards. And I think it can then help frame what I hope will be an important part of the questions that you ask in your state, which is, in addition to how do these standards compare with mine, and if we adopt these new ones, are we moving, will this be a step forward or not? But really help you frame the question in terms of what are the advantages of states acting in common here. The question is not just who's got the better standards, but how would we be helped if we had common standards, and what could we do together if we had common standards? So I'll hope that as you think about the communications in your state and the discussion about adoption, that that's part of the consideration, and we'll help you try to frame that. You want to talk about the evidence?
Yeah. So let me talk about the evidence in general. And we actually showed our members at our summer meeting a sneak peek of what the evidence looks like. And I think that when you see the standards online next week, you'll be pleased at how that evidence is distributed and how you actually can see where the standards came from. Let me talk about the college-ready piece, or the international piece. Both of those, I think there's more evidence in those two areas that you can easily find where these standards are shown to be used by Singapore, Japan, Finland, et cetera. There's a lot of information on the international piece, as well as what constitutes college-ready. As it relates to work readiness, there's less evidence in the what constitutes career readiness, but Achieve's done some of that work already. We relied heavily. The other two groups that we haven't mentioned today, which I find hard to believe because they were central to the process, is ACT and College Board were also part of our initial writing of the college and work ready standards. ACT, we relied heavily on a lot of their work relative to work keys, as well as the Department of Labor and some of their reports about what constitutes those, what are those skills that are needed in those mid-range career and technical jobs that provide livable, not just livable, but meaningful wages so that students can be self-sufficient. So we've looked at a variety of places for the career-ready piece, and I think you'll see in each of those standards when you actually click on one, the range of evidence, what makes that standard college-ready, what makes it internationally benchmarked, and where there's a career readiness link to that particular standard.
Thank you, Scott. Other questions? We've got about 5 minutes left. Can we get a microphone? I'd like other people to hear the question.
You want this? Here.
Okay.
Very simple. I just
Yeah.
wanted to add to the long list of people who have been mentioned in part of the part is higher education. It's very significant education policy,
Right.
and it really depends upon higher ed being there and being engaged in it, and really want to make sure that it follows through into higher ed. And I just didn't happen to hear it yet, but I assume that you would include that.
If I could just give you a quick example of the way we are engaging higher education. Early October, we've been working with ACE, who has pulled together all of the higher ed, a number of the higher ed associations, and they are bringing in college faculty to meet in early October to spend a couple of days talking about the standard, reacting to the initial set of standards, and we'll continue to involve them in collaboration with ACE and the other organizations. In addition, higher ed is well represented currently and will be on the K-12 working groups, validation committee, and any other committee that I just haven't remembered to mention. But we have really attempted to make sure their perspective is included. I have to say that when we met with NCTM, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, that's where I think we got the most valuable feedback from the post-secondary community. So we understand the importance of doing that, because I hope we can get to a point, to Craig's earlier comment, that we can look at these standards and try to then align requirements for admission to colleges and universities. I mean, the collaboration between secondary and post-secondary, I think is as far as NGA is concerned, a desired outcome of this work. Implementation, sure.
Mike, I'm June Streckfus from the Maryland Business Roundtable for Education, and Black & Decker is headquartered in Maryland. And we visited their new product division recently, and they have the drill that they're going to produce in 2020 already developed and designed, but they have a very conservative base that uses their tools So they evolve it year to year to get to that final product. My concern is that given what's happened in the healthcare industry through the town meetings and the very vocal discussions and debates, even though, how do we show that this is kind of a revolutionary approach, but an evolutionary one, and how do you balance that so that all of us are using core messages, but it doesn't look like it's a pre-planned, pre-orchestrated, kind of changing the world effort, that it looks more local and more reasoned.
June, at least one part of the answer to that is you should know that the writing teams have been very sensitive to what is currently in state standards, not for the purpose of making sure that nothing changes, but to understand the issue that both Mitchell and Eric raised, which is how far of a stretch can be made from where things are now to where they need to be. And the conversations that have been going on with states reflect that as well. One of the things that Achieve did last summer was provide each of the ADP network states with a side-by-side comparison between the, in some cases, your own state standards. We couldn't do it for everyone, so we also used the ADP benchmarks between those standards and the Common Core. And the intent was to help you see both what's different about these new standards, but also what's familiar, what is kind of still there, so that I mean, these are organized differently, they are structured a bit differently, but the content expectations are not a dramatic change. And we thought it was important to find a way to send that message so that when people looked at the standards, they understood that there was a fair amount of continuity here as well as change.
Mike, if I could just
Go ahead,
add
Dane.
two additional comments. Thanks, June. One of the areas where we are doing some work and need to do a lot more is really helping states. So as this unfolds, that we help you have that state context orientation to the conversation that you're going to have as opposed to the national orientation. But the other distinction between us and healthcare is that this is really a state leadership conversation, not a federally driven conversation, whether you're for universal health care or not.
The third difference is we're not planning town hall meetings in every congressional district in the country, although if you want to do those, be our guest. I want to bring this session to a, actually I don't want to bring this session to a close, but I have to bring this session to a close so that we can continue the conference. Before I do that, and before I ask you to join me in thanking the panel, I want to do two other things. One is there are a lot of people who have made, a lot of organizations that have made this meeting possible and have made Achieve's work with you possible. And over the course of the time we're together, we'll be acknowledging them. I want to start this morning by acknowledging one group of organizations who are critical to enabling Achieve to do the work that we do with you. And that's a series of foundations that provide our support, many of whom have staff here in the room. So I just want to acknowledge the foundation so that you know who is making our work with you possible. And it's quite a range. Battelle, the Brook Hill Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, IBM, Intel Corporation, Lumina Foundation, the Noyce Foundation, and the Prudential Foundation. All of them and others have been supporting Achieve's work and the work that in particular we do with the states and the ADP network. So I want to acknowledge them and I want to ask you to join me in thanking them.